Tonight we're very happy and very fortunate to have with us author Jonathan Conlin. Jonathan was born in New York and later moved to Britain, where he studied history at Oxford. He went on to do graduate work at the Courtauld Institute and Cambridge. Since his appointment to the University of Southampton in 2006, he has taught courses on a wide range of topics, from the moral philosophy of Adam Smith through the history of cemeteries to the impact of evolution on Victorian society. He regularly comments on museums, heritage, and television history for History Today, Museums Journal, and R4's Today program. And his books include The Nation's Mantelpiece, A History of the National Gallery, The Pleasure Garden, From Vauxhall to Coney Island, Tales of Two Cities, Paris, London, and the Birth of the Modern City, Evolution and the Victorians, Science, Culture, and Politics in Darwin's Britain, a biography of Adam Smith, as well as several edited volumes on a similarly impressive, diverse array of topics. And we are now the beneficiaries of his research on Calouste Gulbenkian. And although his work is not an authorized biography, he was given access to the Gulbenkian archives in Lisbon. Mr. 5%, The Many Lives of Calouste Gulbenkian, the World's Richest Man, was published earlier this year by Profile Books, and following Jonathan's talk, I hope you'll purchase a copy. It's for sale upstairs in our bookstore, and have him sign your copy. The title of his presentation tonight bears the cryptic and intriguing title, Calouste Gulbenkian and the Basturma Problem. Please welcome Jonathan Conlin.
The invitation. A last plea, if any of you are sat on the side, there are four beautiful seats up here at the front. It will be very hard over there to see the images, and there's some fantastic pictures, so please, please, there are two great seats there as well. I'm sure we're all friends here, and if we're not friends already, we will become such. Excellent. Just to correct Mark's introduction, he got one thing wrong. When you go upstairs, don't buy one copy, buy two. So, Mr. 5%, or Calouste Gulbenkian, born in Istanbul, 1869, died in Lisbon in 1955. Before starting on the Basturma question, which was originally supposed to be the introduction to the book, but then Profile, the editor, the publisher, decided that it was best to start with the Red Line Agreement, because that's what Mr. 5% is most famously known for. I don't speak Armenian, but I'm very well aware that as an Odar, I'm trespassing somewhat, and it's odd, but every time I go to Istanbul, Agos, the Armenian language newspaper, publishes an article, usually on the front page, about me, which is a degree of attention I wish I got elsewhere. And I suspect that this headline, in fact, reads, "They couldn't find an Armenian." When I go to Portugal, where the foundation is based, I hear they couldn't find a Portuguese person to write this book. So it has been, whether on the Portuguese side or on the Armenian side, even on the Turkish side, I've been told, we should get a Turk to do this. There has been a sense that I have been trespassing on an area of historical scholarship that was not really mine. I just wanted to introduce the Red Line Agreement because that is the reason why we're all here, the reason why Gulbenkian became so fabulously wealthy, and the one business deal among the many for which he's most widely known today. This was signed by the shareholders of Turkish Petroleum, which became the Iraq Petroleum Company, which Gulbenkian had founded and set up as a kind of cartel between the companies we know today as Total, BP, ExxonMobil, and Royal Dutch Shell. Gulbenkian, they all had 23.75%, the remaining 5% belonged to Mr. 5%. And the reason why the agreement was so important was because, according to within this area, circumscribed by the line, which is black here, but should be red, the shareholders in the company agreed that none of them would be allowed to look for oil, let alone pump it and bring it to market within this area, except through their joint venture, through Turkish Petroleum Company, through TPC. So it was a sense of a cartel, basically, except a kind of weird production cartel. And because the shareholders included the world's leading oil majors, it was really a deal that very much was in the interest of the oil majors, not in the interests of the citizens of Iraq or indeed other states within the area. Because oil companies, as I think we've come to recognize now, they make their money not by selling oil, but by controlling the flow of oil onto world markets in order to keep the price high. So if you think about how they would have viewed the Middle East, say in 1914, at that point the world's #1 oil producing areas were the United States and Russia, specifically the Soviet Empire in what's now Georgia and Azerbaijan, especially around Baku and Grozny. And so the world markets had already been, as it were, divvied up among the leading oil companies, and yet it was been well known since antiquity that there were natural seepages of oil emerging out of the ground. I will continue as Mark goes under the hood and tries to work out what's going on here.
Awkward.
And it could be appropriate, but I think yes, it is New York, but
Let's assume this is all planned.
this is all planned. So the idea was that if you imagine where you're an oil major in 1914, you're aware that there's oil seeping out of the ground near Kirkuk in what's now northeastern Iraq, what was then the Ottoman Empire. But you're perhaps not sure how much oil there is in the Middle East, because other than that naturally seeping stuff, the only oil that had then being produced in the Middle East was in southwest Persia, where Anglo-Persian, the company we now know as BP, had found oil near Masjid Suleiman, which is round here, and they were building a refinery at an island in the Shattell called Abadan, which would later become famous as the world's largest oil refinery. This British company, Anglo-Persian, was really struggling to bring the oil on stream, however, and so there really wasn't much oil coming out of the Middle East. The oil industry was very much still focused on not the Persian Gulf, but the Gulf of Mexico, production in Mexico, Texas, and Venezuela. So if you're an oil major in 1914, you're looking nervously, thinking, we have enough oil, we've got more than enough oil to deal with. We'll be really unsettled if this new source of supply in a part of the world we don't know very well suddenly comes on stream. So what Gulbenkian offered them in the shape of the Red Line Agreement and his Turkish Petroleum Company was a way in which they could, all of them, have their collective hands on the tap labeled Middle East oil, and as it were, turn it on only in dribs and drabs, and otherwise keep the oil underground for future use. This delay in production, therefore, led to a deep resentment among Iraqis and other peoples living inside the Red Line area, because they obviously were deprived of royalties as a result of the slow pace of development. Gulbenkian is assumed to be an oil man who was very much playing exclusively on his Armenianness and his Ottomanness, giving him special access to the ministers who were controlling what's now Iraq before it became Iraq, in the days of the Ottoman Empire. But in fact, as a point I make on a map at the back of the book, entitled Gulbenkian's World, the Middle East was only a small fraction of his truly global vision. Indeed, he cuts his teeth in 1890 speculating in South African and West Australian gold mining shares. He helps Royal Dutch Shell acquire its first Californian and Oklahoma oil production. He acquires Mexican Eagle and a number of Venezuelan oil concessions for them. He's also involved in extracting gold from what's now Siberia, and also involved in extracting oil in Argentina, what's now Indonesia. He's got some mining interests in Congo, around Katanga. So the Middle East, the idea that Gulbenkian is somehow just about Iraq, just about Middle East, is very much an image presented with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, TPC was a very long-term bet that came off and made Gulbenkian fabulously wealthy, but it was only one among many long-term bets he was running. It was just a focus on some of his American and Central American interests. So that hopefully gives you a sense of where Gulbenkian is coming from and where he expanded into. Now, onto the Basturma problem. In late 1944, Calouste Gulbenkian's only grandchild began his final year at Harrow School in England. Though Paris had been liberated, the Second World War was still raging. Other parents were working family connections, endeavouring to secure their children commissions in fashionable guards regiments. 17-year-old Mikhail was eager to join them, but unsure of whether his grandfather would allow him to serve in uniform. Although Mikhail had been born in London and largely educated in England, it was evident that Mikhail's family was different from the family of his fellow schoolboys. They were Armenians. But what did that mean in 1944? For Mikhail himself, the question of military service was tied up with a broader question of his future. For his parents, for his uncle Nubar, and for his grandparents, Calouste and Nivart, it was tied up with their past, however, and their present, as well as the future. In Mikhail's predicament, they recognized their own. For them, it was merely the latest manifestation of that ever-present family dilemma surrounding identity and loyalty. Mikhail's mother, Gulbenkian's daughter Rita, called it the Basturma problem. "Tell me what you eat," wrote the famous 19th century culinary writer Bria Samarin, "and I will tell you who you are." Basturma is a form of dried beef, as we all know, a speciality of the region around Kayseri in central Anatolia, where the Gulbenkians' ancestors settled around 1700. As anyone who can eat it can attest, Basturma's effects on one's breath and digestion make it a particularly pungent metaphor of identity. As a metaphor, it suggests a visceral identity resistant to assimilation, rendering it impossible for Armenians to pass as anything other than exotic Orientals. Among the other equally obvious signs of Armenianness are names ending in IAN, fluency in Armenian, and membership of the Armenian Orthodox Church, which has provided a surrogate for the Armenian state ever since 1375, when the last independent kingdom of Armenia, before obviously the one after World War I, had vanished. Armenian names could be changed, though. Badrik could become Patrick, Mikhail can and did become Mickey. When it had been suggested that Mikhail might have extracurricular tuition in Armenian while at Harrow, his family decided against it. A former Harrovian himself, Mikhail's uncle Nubar, recognized his nephew's fear not to be, quote, made to appear a freak by unusual activities on the part of those responsible for his upbringing. As Mikhail himself pointed out, he was unlikely ever to go to Armenia. When it came to a choice between the Armenian Orthodox Church and following the Church of England's rites of passage observed at Harrow, the family had concluded that, quote, a good Protestant is better than an ignorant Orthodox. Though Calouste Gulbenkian built and endowed St. Sarkis, the Armenian church in London's South Kensington, in 1922, neither he, his wife, nor his children attended services regularly. Calouste had built his career by flying flags of convenience. He had 4 passports: Ottoman, British, Armenian, and Persian. This on the left is his French residency card, where he has managed to produce a very French-looking waxed moustache. The one in the middle, where he looks like he's about to join the barbershop quartet, is his Armenian passport. Then on the right, under the bowler hat, is his British passport photograph. So if you think that the ones on the far left and right were taken almost at the same time, it shows you just how much of a shapeshifter he was. He also served both the Ottoman and Persian empires in a diplomatic capacity. He advised Soviet Russia on their oil policy. He had the ear of the British Foreign Office, and at one point was spending so much time in the French Foreign Office, the Quai d'Orsay, that it was speculated that he might have had a bedroom there. He had plenty of strings to pull, therefore, when it came to keeping his grandson Mikhail out of uniform, or getting him into uniform, for that matter. Indeed, he had already taken steps to secure Mikhail Iranian citizenship Iran was at that point neutral, and which would have protected his grandson Mikhail from being called up to serve in the British armed forces. Mikhail and his mother were reluctant to benefit from this, however. As the latter noted, there were circumstances in which choices had to be made. She invited her mother Nivart and father Calouste to consider whether they hadn't been guilty of using their Armenianness to evade such troublesome circumstances. I would like to clear up, she wrote, and once and for all, this Basturma question that pops up every 25 years with each war. If you take the view that in life one must avoid all unpleasant responsibilities at all cost, then any argument is pointless. But if you want to claim that we are Armenians and that our loyalties are to Armenia, then I have to wonder how you would have reacted if back in 1919 Nubar had wanted to go fight under General Antranik for the independence of our land. If you are honest, you will admit that you would have found it silly and over the top. Rita was right. Although a generous donor to Armenian charities, her father Calouste never indulged in romantic visions of an Armenian national home, in what might be called Armenian Zionism. He and his wife Nivart had been born into the Ottoman Armenian elite of what was then Constantinople, members of one of several distinct ethnic communities that professed loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan and accepted certain civil disabilities, including the denial of the right to bear arms, in return for being left alone to run their own affairs. The Gulbenkians had grown rich as merchants and bankers under the Sultan's protection. Though it may seem strange now, there was nothing remarkable in 1910 about an Ottoman Armenian like Calouste Gulbenkian serving the Sultan in a diplomatic capacity. Gulbenkians had served the Sultan faithfully in many ways over the years and had the Ottoman medals to prove it. As it became clear that the Sultan was no longer willing to keep his side of the bargain, many fellow Ottoman Armenians had come to see an independent Armenian state as the only means of guaranteeing their people's survival. In the First World War, their sons fought and died as volunteers for France and Russia, where General Antranik led them. Both powers considered to be would-be patrons of a future Armenian state. Gulbenkian had worked hard to maintain the supply of oil to the Western powers in the First World War. His son Nubar had the Légion d'honneur to show for it. But otherwise, Rita was right. There had been no suggestion that Nubar might serve in any uniform, let alone in the service of some amorphous Armenian homeland. Even in the era of US President Wilson's 14 points, such forms of Armenian patriotism struck Calouste as absurd and misguided. But in this war, Rita reminded him, it was not a question of some Armenian figment, but of interests much closer to home. Calouste and Nivart had escaped rationing and other hardships by moving from Vichy France to neutral Portugal in 1942. There, Nivart continued to socialize among her set of diplomats and aristocrats, living in the Palace Hotel in Estoril, while Calouste watched over his famous 5% of Middle East oil production from his 3 suites at the Hotel Aviche in central Lisbon. Meanwhile, much of Gulbenkian's precious art collection, as well as his daughter and son-in-law, had been left behind in occupied Paris as unwilling curators of Gulbenkian's palatial home at 51 Avenue Diana, the nearest thing Calouste Gulbenkian ever had to a home, although it's important to emphasize he never slept there. He always went to the Ritz to sleep every night. On the outcome of this war, therefore, hung many questions of immediate interest. To continue quoting from that wonderful Rita letter, the outcome of this war is vital, not only for mankind, but also for our personal and material interests. I say our when I mean your. It's about your return, your house, your belongings, your material and moral comfort. I don't see why other mummies and daddies, little Mikhails, just as precious to them as Mikhail is to us, should sacrifice themselves for you and for him. Friends and other relations of Armenian extraction had, Rita noted, enlisted in the RAF, the French army. One had even decided, quote, that his beef was with the Japanese, and went, aged 19, to enlist in the Australian army. Rita herself had come of age in Paris during the First World War and remembered being challenged for her failure to join the war effort. She was resolved that the same thing would not happen to her son. She asked her parents to permit her to, quote, try to give my son the chance to learn by the mistakes made in my own education, which can all be summed up quite simply by saying that ever since I was a child, I was never allowed to do as others did. We were a law unto ourselves, without any basis of comparison, and I remember how unhappy I was to be stigmatized by my chums because I didn't do any war work. Daddy is a genius, a special number. He can permit himself to do everything in his own way. He has that right. But Mikhail and I want to do as those around us do. As it happens, the English are an admirable race, which one cannot help but admire. Naturally, with our looks, it would be silly to try to pass ourselves off as real English people. I will never call myself anything other than Armenian. But, being in complete ignorance of the Armenian religion, I feel a need to give my loyalty to the country where I was raised, and a priori, Mikhail must feel this even more. In 1945, Mikhail entered the Royal Artillery. Under a policy of last in, last out, he would not be demobilized until 1948, and hence served in Palestine in 1947 to 8. He spent the rest of his life in London, and served as a trustee of the foundation established at the death of his grandfather in 1955. By his own daughter's account, therefore, Calouste Gulbenkian's success as an international financier and oilman allowed him to duck the Basturma question in a way other Armenians, including members of his own family, and including members of the bigger Armenian family here tonight, could or would not. Armenian identity served Gulbenkian's interests because it came with so few strings attached, enabling him to build international consortia without falling under suspicion of fighting for British, French, Persian, or any other national interest. He could simply be an Oriental, a label he applied to himself in private in preference to Armenian. The Armenian language provided a useful means of keeping his business and family secrets from prying eyes. Even the Armenian Orthodox faith was of some value, tempering the risk of appearing too Oriental. Armenia, after all, was the first state to establish Christianity as its official religion. The more Armenia became a revolutionary reality, therefore, the more ambivalent Gulbenkian became about it. A generous supporter of Armenian schools, orphanages, and relief organizations, he initially followed the traditional philanthropic model set by his parents and other members of the Ottoman Armenian elite, focused on the family's home village of Talas, which is in the center of Anatolia, just outside Kayseri. He soon became frustrated by seeing how the provision of real assistance to those in dire need came second or even third behind other priorities, a desire to burnish clan reputation and provide propaganda, or in some cases arms, to this or that Armenian Revolutionary Party. Though he only lasted 2 years in the role, Gulbenkian's experience as head of the main Armenian philanthropic organization, the AGBU, confirmed him in those views, helping to inspire a very different philanthropic vision without borders. Gulbenkian's reputation as a mysterious Armenian oil billionaire was founded on the 1928 Red Line Agreement, in which he and a consortium of the world's leading oil companies carved up the Middle East among themselves. Yet he was as ambivalent towards the oil man moniker as he was towards the Armenian one. During the Red Line negotiations, he laid claim to 4 decades of experience in the oil industry. On closer inspection, however, this experience was less extensive than at first seemed. Apart from one short trip to Baku in his youth, Gulbenkian never visited an oil field, nor did he have any technical understanding of geology or chemistry. A fond collector of epigrams, Gulbenkian's frequent use of the Persian saying, "Oil burns the hands," may have reflected a certain disdain for his industry. Gulbenkian preferred to see himself as a business architect. reacting testily when Walter Teagle, head of ExxonMobil, presumed to call him an oil man to his face. The Turkish, later Iraq Petroleum Company was his house. In a sense, it, not the palace on the Avenue Jena, was Gulbenkian's true home, from which Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, BP and Total did their best to evict him time and time again. Having secured his 5% in 1928, Gulbenkian had to work exceptionally hard to cling on to it. Gulbenkian's story is one of compromise and survival in the face of collapsing empires, shifting borders, and the emergence of new realities. In this sense, it is a very Armenian story, but it would be more accurate to see it as a story of a true internationalist. Gulbenkian's reputation as king of oil was founded not on any profound knowledge of the oil industry, past or present, but on his role as a financier. Whether in Venezuela, Mexico, the Middle East, or Russia, his goal was always the same: to take the politics out of oil by designing international corporate structures in which no one company or no one world power would predominate. Achieving this balance required constant adjustments behind the scenes, making full use of a wide web of diplomats, bankers, newspapermen, and oilmen. It is a token of Gulbenkian's success in this endeavor that when it came to the Turkish Petroleum Company, each of the firm's American, English, French, and Iraqi partners all turned to Gulbenkian for advice at one point or another, while at other points, each suspected him of working for one of the others. Gulbenkian's apprenticeship had been served on the London Stock Exchange, where he cut his teeth speculating in South African mining shares. Although he did his best to forget this episode later, it taught him all he needed to know about the practicalities of finance, introducing shares in debt onto international markets, and using share pools to control share prices. It was these skills which he brought to the new combine of Royal Dutch Shell in the early 1900s, and which helped the firm to expand at a blistering pace. Gulbenkian's relationship with the Dutch head of the combine, Henri Deterding, here on the right, was the closest relationship of his life, rivaled only by that with his own son Nubar. Both partnerships were periodically rocked by crises, and in both cases Calouste cast himself as an unassumingly modest, philosophical Svengali, eager to help the other man realize his full potential, if only they would let him. One of the causes of his distaste for patriotic Armenian philanthropy was Gulbenkian's conviction that others were wasting time hatching wild schemes instead of doing real work to advance themselves as human beings, which was not always the same thing as advancing themselves as Armenians. This struggle between a Protestant individualist work ethic and an Armenian paternalist focus on clan and community was externalized in Calouste's relations with his son Nubar and son-in-law Kevork, father of Mikhail. On the one hand, Nubar, the attention-seeking, unpredictable rebel and prodigal son. On the other, the self-effacing, diligent and dutiful lieutenant, the best son-in-law any Armenian patriarch could hope for. Kevork even managed to give Gulbenkian a grandson, another area where Nubar signally failed despite 3 marriages. Paterfamilias, Armenian, diplomat, mystery man, business architect, collector, philanthropist. As all men do, and as all women do, so Gulbenkian played many parts in his life, sailing under many flags, as the impressive collection of passports he left among his papers in Lisbon indicates. Identifying where his real loyalties and sense of self lay will be difficult, and is perhaps not a very helpful question. If, as Daniel Defoe observed, it is hard to find things more certain than death and taxes, then Gulbenkian was particularly gifted as a shapeshifter. He avoided taxes almost entirely. A hypochondriac who enriched a series of personal physicians, Gulbenkian did his best to cheat death too, apparently expecting to match his grandfather's record by living to 106. Had he done so, he would have survived until 1975. And if he'd been in New York, I could have met him. Although he wouldn't have wanted to meet me. Gulbenkian's first plans for a foundation dated back to 1919 and underwent many changes over the rest of his life. These changes allow us to gauge how the man divided up his wealth between competing responsibilities to his family, to the Turkish Petroleum Company, to the Armenian nation, to his art collections, and to the wider community. In the 1940s, Gulbenkian began a complex series of negotiations with the British and American authorities, trying to see which would allow his foundation to escape estate and death duties. The ostensible focus of these negotiations was his collection of oil paintings, including the Rembrandt on the left, sold to him from the Hermitage by Stalin, and this beautiful Degas on the right. It was widely assumed during World War II and in the early 1950s that wherever the art went, the famous 5% and the rest of the money would follow. And Gulbenkian seemed happy enough to have his artworks serve as proxies for the massive fortune in oil interest whose financial value far exceeded theirs. In his final years, he seemed to lose perspective, putting the paintings first and appearing unconcerned at what happened to his 5% and other assets. Thanks to a new pipeline, his income was now vast, so vast Gulbenkian grew tired of trying to conceive it. The resulting indifference, suspicion of Nubar, as well as irritation with the British and Americans over estate taxes, led Gulbenkian to hesitate long enough for his physical condition and mental acuities to fade. Gulbenkian's final years are a tragic spectacle. The would-be benefactor's reluctance to pay taxes became an obsession, a dangerous one in a man in his 80s. His children threatened to become caricatures of the grasping, scheming heirs-in-waiting. In contrast to the care and attention Gulbenkian gave to studying the fine print of any British or American proposal to host his foundation, he failed to perform due diligence on similar offers from Portugal. This probably reflects a somewhat sentimental view of Portugal as a small nation whose officials were somehow incapable of the kind of self-serving plotting Gulbenkian experienced from so many other nations in the course of his long life. Gulbenkian could not speak Portuguese and was hardly in a position to gain much of a perspective on the Portuguese dictator Salazar's new state from the windows of the Aviz Hotel. As his closest advisor, the English barrister Sir Cyril Radcliffe noted, Gulbenkian may have seen Portugal as an interim solution, a way of buying time. If that is what it was, it failed. Having outfoxed the tax authorities of Britain, France, and the United States, the terms eventually reached after his death with the Portuguese authorities saw Salazar impose his own 100% estate tax on Gulbenkian's fortune. By then, Gulbenkian was past caring. It was the structure of the Turkish Petroleum Company as an international collaboration, and the paintings, one senses, that mattered most to Mr. 5%. At the end of the day, these were what Gulbenkian considered worth fighting for. As his friend, the French poet Alexandre Léger, known under the pen name Saint-Jean-Perse, observed 3 years before his death, in his inner personality, Mr. Gulbenkian is a man of rare nobility. He is like a king, constantly fighting for the protection of his kingdom. It is so sad he fights alone. Like his vast fortune, so Gulbenkian's idea of a new kind of philanthropy, one as international as its founder, was too difficult for one old man to conceive and hold on to, let alone fight for. Thank you.
And I know Jonathan is eager to answer all of your questions.
Can I just preempt one question, because it does come up a lot, and I've given This is my 6th talk this week.
Wow.
So it's often told that Gulbenkian wanted to give, if we can, when we edit the film, can we take this bit out? Because that would be great. Because I'm aware that you might come across as, I might come across as peevish in saying this very generously, but expectation was so much higher that inevitably he comes across as a disappointment to many, and therefore there's a need for these kind of stories that, someone told me yesterday that he was going to give it all to the AGBU, but they fired him after 2 years from being president. That's not true either. So I really don't want to come across as peevish, but and I'm very willing to discuss, I think it's a fascinating topic, about how Gulbenkian felt towards the Soviet Republic of Armenia and how he felt about whether Armenia needed to be a sovereign state, a place to go, or whether he was happy as it is an intellectual idea. But I just let's just say I'm nipping that in the bud.
Bud being nipped, yes.
I'm actually a fascinating talk, thank you. I was just curious about his son-in-law's background, like where he grew up and also whether Mikhail had any children.
Yeah, so this is Isayan, the Isayan family, or the current descendants spell it without a Y. I know that other members of the family, more distant, spell it Y-E with one S. But the Isayan family which in a typical Ottoman Armenian...
I went to the SI
yes.
elementary school there, so it's
the
without the Y and one S, yes.
Yes, so the Isayan family were richer than the Gulbenkians, and so there's two connections. One is that Gulbenkian's son, the daughter Rita, marries into the Isayans, but Gulbenkian's wife was an Isayan as well.
Oh.
So there's two connections to the Isayan family. And they get married, Nivart and Calouste, in 1892 in London. And their courtship is quite long precisely because of this difference in wealth. The Nivart's parents look a bit down on the Gulbenkians. Well, they're Amira, but they're not quite as rich as we are. The Isayans by that point had already reached the point where they no longer really were involved in the day-to-day running of their businesses. They turned into investors, sort of coupon clippers, as it were. Whereas the Gulbenkian's father was still going to the office every day, working quite hard. So the Isayan family, apparently, the story there is they made their money by getting the scrap metal concession or something like that. So Kevork, who's is from the same Isayan family, who marries Rita, Gulbenkian's son, they have 2 children. Sorry, let me get this right. Yes. And so the great-grandson, who is now the direct descendant, sits on the board of the foundation to this day. So, Mikhail had 2 children, and that Martin and Joanna are as it were, the living representatives of the family today.
Thank you.
David?
I have a brief comment and a brief question. About this Basturma problem, I wouldn't make too much of this. I mean, it sounds interesting. I mean, you know, the British eat bland food, and the British hated everybody and killed everybody. The Irish, the British, Indians, East India, Africa. So, you know, if they didn't like a little garlic on somebody's bread, I wouldn't make too much of it. My question is, of Gulbenkian's fortune, how much goes to Armenian charities now?
I think it's 200%.
I think it's 2%.
Yeah, about 2%. So 95% is spent within Portugal. And the foundation is the 36th richest foundation in the world with an endowment of between $3 and $4 billion.
So how much goes to Armenians?
2 or 3%.
Oh, a second. Okay. Hold on.
Hi, thank you very much. I only knew Gulbenkian name is like a foundation that gives money to actually some causes that have to do with Turkish Armenian, if you want to call it reconciliation. Not my words, but nowadays I do hear about people in the Armenian community who think that, you know, whatever the foundation may do in the Turkish-Armenian relations, actually actually is biased in favor of the Turkish government. Do you have any comments about that?
Wow. I think I don't
Is
really
it related to your preemptive, off the record question? Because obviously there are those who see him as not being as involved in the Armenian cause, maybe, for recognition. I think it's, I just came upon this the last couple of weeks, and I need to ask somebody, that's why I'm here. So.
Yes, I can't really comment on the Armenian Communities Department of the Gulbenkian Foundation's policy and what they're doing. That's for them. It is fair to say that in the early years of the foundation, they spent a greater percentage on their Armenian department. So it was, I think it was 15%.
So it
In
got
the early years, like in the
progressively
50s,
less
and it got progressively, yes.
I wonder why.
There may be a reason, but I could possibly comment.
Yes, Ben?
I'd love to know what are the reasons, we're going to ask Sophia, that made you take up this topic, why you wrote it, and to include an answer to what fascinates you most about this man. Did you grow to like him more or like him less as you grew to know him? So all of that.
Yes, well, in terms of as a topic, it was through, I wrote my PhD on the history of the National Gallery, the one in London, and Gulbenkian originally had the idea in the late 1930s and 40s that he would pay to endow a kind of frick gallery, its size annex that was going to be to one side of the National Gallery, which would receive its art collections, including not just the paintings but everything, and that the money would go to the National Gallery as well, which would have been the greatest, as it were, what if or hypothetical in the history of the National Gallery, because it would have made it the Getty in terms of its pull and its budget. So that's how I got into it. And I suppose I had the sense that I found Gulbenkian intriguing because I did read the 1957 biography by Ralph Hewins, which is also called Mystified Percent. And there was just so much in that just didn't make any sense, that Gulbenkian had owed his wealth to knowing exactly how much to bribe Ottoman officials. Well, I'm not sure that. I'm sure there are plenty of other lots of well-connected Armenians in the Ottoman Empire who know just as much about bakshish as he does. So I suppose I was trying to come up with a satisfactory explanation for that. In terms of how I feel about him, it's people often have this expectation that biographers fall in love with the topic that they're working on, and we certainly do live with our subjects, and that's a fair thing to say. And I think if my wife were here, she would agree. She might even strike a sort of Princess Diana pose and say there are 3 people in our marriage. Unfortunately, Gulbenkian and I are now divorcing, so divided attention again. But Gulbenkian doesn't want my affection, doesn't want me to like him. He wants me to respect him, and I respect him. In my head, he's always Mr. Gulbenkian. I don't go around thinking about Calouste, so I think that's itself maybe suggestive. So to be honest, Gulbenkian doesn't care what I think, and he's not the kind of ingratiate like Nubar would care. If I was writing about Nubar, he would want me to be his friend, and he'd want me to like him, and he'd be sort of playing up and trying to get my attention. Gulbenkian would probably not want a biography to be written if he were around today. He did not like being in the media, did not want attention at all. So I think he just wanted to be alone, as in this wonderful, one of the last photographs, alone in his garden with his ducks, his geese, his pheasants, for whom he constructed a series of miniature castles. So he loved animals a lot. That was a big surprise for me, how much he loved cats, birds, nature, all that sort of thing. Really softened him.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to ask 2 questions. One, why is the museum? Why Portugal? And the other was, did he pick out the paintings, or did someone buy it on his behalf? I'm curious if
Yes.
these were ones that he
I mean, certainly when I first went around the museum, there was a sense that this was kind of interwar rich man's taste. You know, you go around and you think, well, there's one Rubens, right? Okay, well, where's Rembrandt? Tick, Rembrandt. You know, there's got to be some full-length English grand manner portraits by Van Dyck, tick. Gainsborough's, yes, tick. You know, you can feel a bit like he's following a model of what makes a good collection that's being set by other people. So it was genuinely surprising to find that he did not really rely on advisors the way other business moguls do to this day. He really did try to educate himself. He was very time poor, but he took time to read books on art history, to hire curators to give him homework and actually take him around museums to train himself. And he never relied entirely on their judgment. He very much, when he works, had to please him. If it was a portrait of an 18th century lady by Reynolds, he would often buy works and live with them for a while. And if the, as he would put it, the female portrait didn't flirt with him, they would divorce. That was his word, and he would give the painting back. In terms of why Portugal, well, 1942, he's living in Vichy as an Iranian diplomat. Iran enters the war on the Allied side. You can't stay in Vichy after that because you're obviously an enemy, right? So it's a toss-up between Switzerland and Portugal, and he thinks, well, I'll go to America. So he goes to via Spain to Lisbon, and fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately for America, he hears just in time that the American tax authorities are waiting for him to swallow him whole when he arrives in New York. So he decides, well, I'm not going to go to America, I'm going to stay in Lisbon, nice climate, neutral country, lots of rich people holed up in Lisbon during the Second World War, Rothschilds, lots of other rich people. And then he decides to stay. He goes back to Paris when the war ends regularly, but he's still living in a hotel, so he's not really making Portugal his home. Still living in a hotel.
Can I just ask a follow-up? You said Rothschild, so was he friends with a lot of
Oh yeah,
Rothschilds? And
yeah, friends with Rothschilds, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He had a con, yeah.
Um,
So, it's not a question, it's a comment. The area that you have encircled as his region of operations for his commission, I wonder how real is that drawing? Because I have seen several other previous drawings showing different areas, specifically excluding Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And another one that has been a major subject of debate is Kuwait, because it had great influence in Iraq, but no influence in Kuwait.
Yeah.
So I'm not questioning, but I'm just making a comment about that drawing.
Yeah,
This
I mean,
one.
this is something I obviously looked at quite in depth. In 1928, when they're drawing the line, it's quite complicated because under what's called the Foreign Office Agreement in 1914, the terms of reference or the area is not defined on a map in that agreement, it's defined simply as the Ottoman Empire in Asia. So in 1928, the Ottoman Empire is gone. But so the people are having to dig up old atlases and work out, well, what was the Ottoman Empire in Asia in 1914? Where did the Sultan's writ go and where did it stop? So, as you mentioned, one of the dodgy areas which is difficult to work out is around Kuwait. That's because Kuwait's status as kind of semi-independent, it was unclear whether they still paid nominal suzerainty to the Sultan, but they'd otherwise been quite independent. So they decided to exclude Kuwait. And they also exclude the Khorasan archipelago, which is down here because Royal Dutch Shell is already working a concession there. But in terms of the Hejaz and Nejd, as it was, in terms of the Arabian Peninsula, the Ottomans, as I wonder if I have that on the map, always claimed that. If you look at this inset map, this is from an Ottoman. This is an Ottoman atlas from 1874, and the pink is the edge of the Ottoman Empire. There's the Saudi Arabia, they claim all of it. So if you're saying it's the Ottoman Empire, in this map, I think you have to, in 1928, say what the Ottomans thought. Saudi Arabia, what we now call Saudi Arabia, the peninsula, was part of the Ottoman Empire, because there it's all in pink. So that's where I'm coming from.
The other thing, the reason that Gulbenkian moved to Portugal rather than the States, of course it was the tax issue, money. But probably the greatest factor which had an influence on his decision was his managing director, who was a Portuguese. And he passed away only recently. For many years, he had been his assistant, and he was the one who convinced Calouste to go to Portugal and move his wealth there, tax-free.
This is José de Azevedo Perdigal, who becomes the first chairman of the foundation and serves for 50 years. Gulbenkian only meets him after he arrives in Portugal, so he can't have persuaded him to go to Portugal. So, but certainly after Gulbenkian arrives in Portugal, he meets José de Azevedo Perdigal, and Perdigal, after a few years, becomes one of the lawyers in the inner circle, and certainly is crucial in secretly collaborating with Salazar to ensure that Salazar is kept informed of Gulbenkian's plans. And after Gulbenkian's death, it's he that's instrumental in ensuring that the foundation becomes a gift to Portugal. Because under the terms of its registration in Portugal after Gulbenkian's death, the board has to consist of only Portuguese nationals. And by making that the requirement, that's how Salazar makes sure that the money's going to stay in Portugal. And there's only one foreigner allowed on the board, that's the family representative, which is Martinez to this day. So that requirement, which Salazar and this Perdigal guy cooked up between them, was crucial to, as it were, the nationalization by Salazar of a foundation that Gulbenkian intended to be for all of humanity.
Yeah, the Wisdom Museum that had attended twice, I was really disappointed at the Armenian collection. There was a very small section, some ceramics or whatever. Does he have more Armenian collection, but it's not displayed in the museum? Or is it just that?
Unlike most museums, the Calouste Gulbenkian Museum shows, I would probably say 98% of its collection is on display. I was very insistent that they show me the paintings that aren't on display, which are in the basement, and we're really not missing anything. Gulbenkian acquired what he called, the real works of art, but also had a kind of a fondness for pictures of nymphs. What he called decorative pictures, often of nymphs, bathing nymphs of different kinds, which he would usually tire of when they weren't flirting with him anymore and give them away to friends. But when he died, he naturally still had some, and they're the ones sitting in the basement, along with the cremated remains of one of his beloved cats, Mimosa, is in the basement too, and some of his birds are there stuffed as well. But in terms of the Armenian art, Gulbenkian did not collect Armenian art, and to be fair, had no interest in it. I wish I could say that he liked Armenian art, but he really just was not interested.
Georgia, I was wondering, how did the Sykes-Picot agreement, I think I'm saying it correctly, how did that affect Gulbenkian's operations in the area? And then also, I was wondering, the Balfour Agreement to establish Israel. Was there any thoughts or anything how Gulbenkian felt about the establishment of Israel?
I don't think the Balfour Declaration would have had much effect on Gulbenkian's oil dealings, except maybe confirm that the British are in charge there, which he would have no problem with, because he was a British citizen by that point. In terms of Sykes-Picot, the 1916 carve-up of Syria, what's now Syria, and Iraq between Britain and France, he had no problem with that, because it's making the Middle East an Anglo-French condominium, and he's nothing himself. He's constantly, he spends most of his life in London and Paris, going back and forth. So he's very happy to see any parts of the world that have oil carved up between the two. Because as you see in the passports, he can pretend to be French and he can pretend to be English. He's got both sides.
I will take one more. Nancy,
I was curious, the Armenian genocide, do you have, what his thoughts on that, or feelings, or?
Yes, this is not, I'm afraid, not another not very appealing aspect of Gulbenkian, Gulbenkian and the genocide. Well, Gulbenkian obviously grew up in the Ottoman Empire, might have been in Istanbul in 1896 in the post-Dashnak attack on the Ottoman Bank massacres. His family had to escape then, and so some element of violence against Armenians was, not to put a fine point on it, was kind of normal. I mean, it was kind of, I'm talking about low-level massacres, obviously not state-organized genocide violence on a huge scale. So genocide as a word did not exist at the time. So I suspect that what happened was Gulbenkian only really hears about the scale of what's been happening in sort of 1919, 1920, when distant family members who, as it were, been scattered to the four winds by the death marches and all that sort of thing, start to get back in touch and say, hello, it's your second cousin 3 times removed. I've escaped, tends to be the women folk, obviously, but all my male relatives were taken to the killing places and shot. So Gulbenkian certainly is aware of it. But what is striking, I suppose, is that he does continue to plan in 1919, 1920. He's still interested in buying property in Istanbul, very much wants to retire and have a garden on the Bosphorus to retire to. And he remained in fitful contact with young Turk ministers. So he's not, he doesn't react the way we might hope he did.
So, I take it the Gulbenkian family was prominent in Calouste.
Yes, biggest family, yes.
And they dispersed during the genocide. How did his immediate family escape, and where did they go?
Well, okay, so by the genocide, there's none of his immediate family, or even not so immediate family, left anywhere near. They're all in Paris, or London, or
So they left before the genocide?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, they're wealthy, Amiras, so, I mean, the Assaillans have started to move to France and Liverpool in the 1870s, so they retain their ties to Talas, and they pass on the obligation to pay for the Armenian school, the Gulbenkian school, the Gulbenkian church, the Gulbenkian gymnasium in Talas. That's very much part. But they themselves never go to Talas. They feel a very strong tie, but they never go there themselves. It's about identity, it's not about actually going there. So when the genocide happens, I'm sure there are some Gulbenkians, but they're quite distant Gulbenkians. And today in Talas there's only one Armenian left, Sarkis Teke, who I remember meeting when I was there. And now, sadly, even the gravestones and the foundation stones from the schools have all been, as it were, appropriated and used as building material for other buildings. Yes.
The reason I ask this question is, as a kid, my father introduced me to 2 aunts, 2 cousins of his, who are Gulbenkians, who lived in Racine, Wisconsin, of all places. And they came to visit us several times in New Jersey, and they told their story of escaping the genocide. And actually the 2 sisters were separated into 2 other Arab families and eventually made their way from Aleppo to the United States. My father's family went to Istanbul, so they weren't connected, but they were related. And he always told me the story of Gulbenkians being heroic in escaping the genocide from Talas. So I never really...
Yeah, these would be other Gulbenkians.
Other Gulbenkians.
Parts of the family.
There were lots of them.
There were lots of them, yeah. They're all over the place. His cousins go and settle in America and are still living in Pound Ridge, New Jersey, where they set up their carpet manufactory and all that sort of thing. They have their own foundation, the Gulabi Gulbenkian Foundation. So, yeah, this tradition goes on.
Gulabi Gulbenkian. Gulabi.
Joe?
You mentioned that at some point in time the Gulbenkians moved to Caesarea.
No, they moved from
Where did
probably
they-
further east, we think in Persia, but we have no
Where they
idea.
originally, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And during the independent republic, did the
Mhm.
Gulbenkians pay any much attention to that?
To the Republic.
Yeah, the Republic in 19.
There's some, I really wanted to find those, there were some suggestions that he was helping with set up an Armenian state bank and, for example, or advising the fledgling state on currency, that sort of thing. Or, you know, helping them more as he could have done, helping them by giving them money to buy weapons to fight the Turks and the Russians. But no, I mean, the sad thing is he was very busy acquiring Mexican oil companies from Royal Dutch Shell at the time.
If there had been oil there, perhaps we might have.
Actually, in 1919, they thought there was oil in Armenia, but he still isn't interested.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Why not?
That's a good question. I think he's got his hands full with some of the other areas where we already know
It's
those
outside the
oils.
line.
Interesting. Yeah, that's true enough. Well, Johnson, thank you very much. Books, refreshments, thank you for coming. Thank you.